your guest, Laura. So invite me on more often. That's what I'm going to say.
Well, I will do. If you're. I would do if you weren't running about here and there doing music festivals and interviews and all sorts of stuff. You seem to be doing those on a Friday a lot, so I don't get the chance very much.
It's good fun. For anybody who's wondering, obviously, when we originally set up a State of Mind, it was always the intention to cover all forms of football, music, media, culture, art, and everything in between. But we couldn't do a lot of that, Laura, could we, during the lockdown? So we were kind of stuck to our seat in the studio doing live streaming. That's where we discovered that there was a community out there who wanted to talk about Celtic every day, so we're going to keep doing that every single day. And in the meantime, as you say, bouncing about festivals and shopping centres and anything else that I need to do to obviously get the video features that we want to get. So we were in Manchester earlier this week, which was great fun, meeting a bit of a legend in the Hacienda era, Dave Haslam. So that interview will be with you very, very soon.
I'm still waiting for the documentary feature on Westlife, folks, but I promise you it will be available at some point, I'm sure.
Did I tell you I met them one time? That's another story for another podcast.
I hope you treated them well. They're my boys. They
were kind of unknown at that point. It was in an airport.
Oh well, there we go. Like, we'll go into that at another time. That's a whole other show. But as Paul touched on, there's a lot of content on the channel, football related and otherwise. So in order to help us get it out there, please hit a like on this video. The Friday Club are good at hitting the like button. I happen to see, whether it's my reminders or not, it really does help the channel get out there. And subscribe if you haven't done. Again, totally free of charge. The word subscribe's a bit misleading, but if you do that for us, not only does it mean that you'll get notified every time we go live, but it means that we'll get out to more people and the channel will continue to grow, which obviously we would love to happen. But we'll get back to what we're here to talk about on A Celtic State of Mind, the bread and butter of A Celtic State of Mind, Paul, which is, of course, Celtic. I've not had a chance to talk to you much about it over the past few weeks, but how, in general, have you seen the pre-season going? What's been your impression of how things have gone?
I'm going to hang my hat on that quote that Ange made in relation to they're not preparing to win. They're not there to win matches in pre-season. They're preparing to win matches, and I think that pre-season can give you a false sense of where you are sometimes. I remember a pre-season where we beat a team 21-0, and check it on the wiki. It was incredible. But there's other pre-seasons that aren't so great that turn out to be fantastic seasons. And I just have to go back to the centenary year. My first ever game was against Liverpool in the Tommy Burns testimonial, and they beat us 1-0. But, the following week, Arsenal beat us 5-1. And you're looking at that, because there was a real overhaul of the squad back then. Big Billy had come back in to be the manager, and you weren't that positive going into the new season, and everybody knows what happened. But I think this time round it was all about having a look at the new arrivals, Laura, and we've spoken quite a bit on Axom about the players who we were introduced to during the season last season, but I think we're going to see different beasts entirely, and I'm talking about Matt O'Reilly and Reo Hatate and Daisen Maeda, and I think we've seen enough flashes of they guys. And by the way, I think also up to his absence, I thought Giakoumakis was looking like he was showing the version 2, the V2 of the player he can be for Celtic. And I'm as excited about those guys as I am about the new arrivals.
I think there's a lot there that, like you said, that there's some freshness that we're hoping to get from the players who maybe had a bit of a slower start or maybe only came in at New Year, and Reo Hatate's one of them who we'll go on to. Michael Ross kind of comes in with a bit more of a certified opinion that pre-season means nothing, which I suppose it doesn't, because you mentioned the 21-0 game, but we had that last pre-season as well. We'd played well in a few games and then got absolutely battered 6-2 by West Ham back at Celtic Park, so it can happen.
I think the two games against English opposition at home, I was getting a wee bit concerned after the Preston game as well. I just didn't think we looked anywhere near where we had to be. And of course, a big part of that was the fact that we had the qualifiers, Laura, and the pre-season time was so minute between the end of the season to the first competitive game. So although, I agree to a degree, when you get pumped off West Ham 6-2 and you've got a goalie who doesn't know how to look after his near post, it does become a concern. because you think to yourself, we've not got a long enough period to put those things right. This time around, fitness, as I say, looking at the version 2 of a lot of the players, and also bedding in the new players. And when we look at, as I'm sure we will at some point during the show, your kind of predicted 11s, it's going to be interesting because, I know Jota and CCV are classed as new players, but there's not going to be a great deal of change in the starting lineup as there was to last season, is there?
I don't think so. I mean, I was just thinking about it there. Like, I've not even thought really about my predicted 11 before today. And but actually, when I think about it, regardless of the new signings, I think there will be people coming in who might, establish their place in the team. But I very much am in agreement with you that I think it will probably be very much of a muchness compared to last season, which in its own way is a good thing because that means we've managed to secure signings like Jota, Maeda, Carter Vickers, who if you'd told us before the pre-season would happen, then we'd be delighted with that. But we will get on to doing that in a second. Before we move on to the first talking point, which was going to be the re-emergence of Reo Hatate, before we do that, you touched on a point there that is an interesting one to me. The fact we've not had Champions League qualifiers this pre-season, which has been such a regular feature of our pre-seasons before. Now, if you'd asked me at any other time, any other year, I'd have said that's an advantage not to have that. Do you think in some ways we've lacked a little bit of get up and go because we haven't had that competitive edge to the games, or do you still think it's an advantage not to have to go through that?
I think overall it's an advantage. I guess you could look at some of the nuances of that as well, Laura, but I just think, we've not had, as Paddy McGoldrick said on a Tuesday, we've not had that Champions League music at Celtic Park for 5 years. And there's absolutely no coincidence that in those 5 years we've always sold at least one big asset. So this pre-season, we're looking forward to the Champions League music being played at Celtic Park, and we've not lost an asset. And I think that is massive. So, I know what you mean. It's almost as if you can take your time to get ready in the morning sometimes, you know what I mean? And that's what it feels like a wee bit here. But I think they'll be fine-tuned enough by the time 4:30 comes on Sunday. But I do think there's definitely that correlation between no Champions League music at Celtic Park for 5 years, yet we've sold assets every single season within that period. This time round, we're in Champions League groups, no sales. That's how big that is for us.
Yeah, I can't remember the name of the rule, but there's apparently some rule in work that you extend the work you have to do to the timeline to fit it, and I think I'm definitely guilty of that at times. But I work better under a deadline. But hopefully Ange is the same. John Bossas says on YouTube, unbelievable to think that CCV and Jota are full-time Celtic players. And as we touched on there, and as you've said there, Paul, it's like, that alone would have been enough for a lot of Celtic fans going into this season to have those players permanently in the squad. But another player I wanted to talk about specifically is Reo Hatate. He came onto the scene in January, absolutely hit the ground running, scored those 2 goals against Rangers in a very Lubomir Manavci-esque way. Instant Celtic hero, but he did fall off towards the end of last season. Dipped a little bit in terms of form, was certainly looking tired. And when you consider the fact he's basically nearly played 2 years of consistent football, by the time the end of the season came, that's understandable to see why. But we have seen him come a bit more back into the fore as one of the higher quality players we have at the club in the pre-season. Do you think that rest period has made a difference for him? Do you think we're going to see a different player this season?
I think that this is going to be a massive part of what we're talking about earlier, Laura, with the players who we've seen glimpses of, but we haven't seen them playing for a full season consecutively. So you've got a guy in Reo Hatate, like you say, who I think could play the season and a half with no rest. He spoke about how that affected him physically, mentally, emotionally, how drained I think he looked when you look at some of the later performances compared to the first. I mean, when he hit the ground, I remember talking to JP that week, and he was saying, let's calm down, because people were going on about him being the next £25 million player going out to Celtic Park. But JP was very cautious because he said, we've only seen wee glimpses of this fella, 24 years of age. And I think Alan Morrison pointed out, you look at the amount of senior football he's played, not a great deal. He hasn't played a great deal of senior football because of his passage. It wasn't, football academy and then into the first team. So he didn't start playing senior until a couple of seasons ago. He's not, used to the rigours of the Scottish Premiership. And I think, though, if we were going to use this pre-season, with everything that's already been said, as a marker on how Hatate's going to look this season, I think it fills me with a lot of optimism. The way that someone very usefully went into the Norwich highlights and basically done a highlights reel of Reo Hatate, and I seen it on Twitter. The way he was breaking up play, Laura. We're going about needing defensive midfield players, but a lot of what he done against Norwich, I think, was overshadowed with the Pearson passes, the cross-field passes it was making. But a lot of his defensive play was excellent against Norwich. And I think what we've got in Hatate is a player that we've only seen a version of him last year, and we're going to see a different, more improved, fitter, high-tempo version of Hatate this year.
It's an interesting thing that you point out there, because I think, certainly in my mind and in a lot of people's minds who I speak to, he seems to be very much an attacking threat. We've seen him bang in goals from the edge of the box consistently. As you touched on, he's got distribution that a lot of players would kill for, but that aspect of his game where he can break up the play is something that's going to be vital for us, especially if we're looking to set David Turnbull and Matt O'Reilly and the like free going forward. Do you think Hatate can be a reliable sort of defensive mid for us, or is that asking a little bit too much of him?
Well, I think one of the big questions through the pre-season's been what's the makeup of this midfield, Laura? We've got such quality in the midfield, and we've added to that. Obviously, we lost 2 players, but we have added it to that with Aaron Moy, and I've previously said that he's got elements of Rogic and of Beaton in his play. So I guess what you're looking at is the makeup of that and how you want McGregor to play, because a lot of people say he's wasted if he's a defensive mid. He flourishes more going forward. And I don't think it's going to be as simple as that. I think that Ange Postecoglou is going to be looking at both the players, not so much O'Reilly, but both Hatate and McGregor sharing the load, if you like. So you've seen some of the qualities that Hatate has defensively. And I know that when he signed, people were saying, he can play left back. And I think that's like saying McGregor can play left back because he played a few games there. You don't want to play either of those 2 players left back, but it shows that they do have the defensive qualities required to break up the play in the midfield. And I think both of them, I would suggest, are better as offensive players, but they've both shown that their defensive prowess is something that I think can bode well for the future. You look at some of the games that McGregor basically grabbed by the scruff of the neck last season when we went a goal down early to Rangers. And he is going back to play. He's breaking up plays, winning the ball, and he's starting attacks from defence. And that transition, I think, you're going to see a big part of McGregor's play this season, and you're also going to see that with Hatate, the transition from defence to attack. And these guys, particularly Hatate, he can pick a ball up in his own half, break up play, but then switch the wing, play Jota in, for example, and cross, the crossfield passes. For me, there's certain players who can do that. There's other ones who should never try it. And I think, Hatate's crossfield passes are up there. And I remember Van Dijk used to do it with very little, it would appear, effort. And he would ping the ball at Celtic Park from one end to the other. And Hatate can do that as well. So I don't think anything's is that simple with Ange. I think he'll be looking for the pair of them to do a lot of the defensive work and a lot of the offensive work as well, Laura.
Yeah.
And interchange.
I think so. Gary Malone brings up an interesting point on YouTube here, says Hatate plays risky passes. If he's on form, it's breathtaking, but when he's off form, it can look horrendous. We need to play more risky passes, though, so hopefully he can stay fit and well. And I think that's something that I really like about him is, I'm willing to give players a bit of leeway as far as riskiness goes if more often than not they pull off the incredible and you can see a player who can make a real difference, who can find that pass. Because so often against teams, especially before Ange came along and in Ange's early days, actually, when we were against teams who, banked their defence and midfield against us, we found them hard to break down. Very often it was because we didn't have a player willing to take a risk. And if we've got ones like Hatate who can do that, then surely that's going to make your Livingstons and Kilmarnocks of this world a bit more of a bit easier of a task to overcome.
There are so many occasions during the season where you're up against that packed defence and you want someone to take a risk. And there was, a frustration crept in previously with the previous regime where we weren't taking enough of these risks, and it was like you're coming up against that bank and we ran out of ideas. I don't think we're going to be in that position. We've got enough players in the likes of O'Reilly, Turnbull, Hatate, and then you start talking about the wingers. Take a risk, take a player on, swing the ball. And we weren't taking risks 2 seasons ago. But now we've got a whole host of players who are willing to do that. And I think there's going to be occasions where defences just won't be able to live with Celtic, once we start turning that screw, Laura. Domestically, at least. The European thing's something we'll talk about. But domestically, I think it's a frightening prospect, because this argument about Celtic standing still, spending 13 million to stand still is a nonsense. Because the players that we have are a year older and wiser, and then they've got the success behind them, which does brilliant things for the galvanisation of the team spirit and the morale. The player that we see in Jota so far in the pre-season in flashes could be a better version again than the player we saw last season. So I'm very excited about the whole process of that. But again, on the eve of the flag day, on the eve of day one of the new season, Laura, they're always a wee bit of trepidation. How's it going to go? And I remember one of the games against Aberdeen, we ended up winning 1-0, Chris Commons, and it was a bit of a damp squib. And that can sometimes happen. I just want a result. However, I would love to see that performance that, we've seen in the pre-season for first halves, maybe first half hours, when the strongest lineups on the park. And it has looked high tempo, it's been attractive to watch. But obviously he's chopped and changed his hands, he's chopped and changed the personnel. But I'm looking forward to it on Sunday, and I don't think many teams will live with us domestically this year.
Yeah, I'm hoping so. And certainly I don't think standing still is something you can accuse us of when we are bringing in new players as well, like Maurice Yents, like Bernabe at the right back, or left back, sorry, and we are looking to make those changes and strengthen the squad in the areas we need to strengthen them. Urban Culture comes in and says, need to go early today, working over the weekend, be back here come Tuesday, 5-0 up and top of the league. Hoping so, Urban Culture. Not one to predict the future, but I hope it happens. Speaking of new signings, I was at Celtic Park last week, as you well know. Paul John speaking.
Who were you chatting to this time, Laura?
This time it was my mate Big Moritz Yents. Got a handshake and everything off him when he was leaving the room. So he was an absolute gent. It was a pleasure to meet him and speak to him. Although I did set eyes rolling with my question, I have to say, because I had decided to go down the old Matt O'Reilly route. But he did have interesting things to say about Matt O'Reilly. My question had been trying to be a little bit more introspective and a little bit more interesting, and asking him how much Yents himself had improved as a player since the last time they were teammates at Fulham. But he turned the answer on its head and was very complimentary of Matt O'Reilly, saying that he had blown up last year and that he had become a real fan favourite here, which I don't think anybody is in doubt of. Talking about the midfield that we've talked about Hatate, but Matt O'Reilly, I mean, it's only come to the fore in terms of discussions again because of Yents coming in and talking about O'Reilly himself. But I mean, I can't see him being anything other than a first choice player in the team next season. Can you?
No, I totally agree with that, and particularly now that Rogic has left the building, and that again, we could dedicate podcasts to the big man, Tommy Rogic. I'd have kept him. For argument's sake, I definitely would have kept him. But I think JP made a good point yesterday again about Rogic, about we probably got an extra year out of him that we didn't expect under Ange.
Yeah.
And Ange is maybe thinking, right, I've got the maximum I can get out of this guy, and it's time for him to move on. Where he ends up.
Did you see him wandering the airport in the background of that One Direction photo?
Loved it. Absolute full credit to anybody who spotted that kind of stuff, because I thought it was a Cold War Steve moment where someone had just placed him there, but it was genuine. Obviously swaggering about with a bit of Louis Vuitton and all that kind of stuff.
I was looking the part, I have to say.
He always looks the part, doesn't he? But going back to Matt O'Reilly, what I like about him and Maurice Yents, and this comes from Peter Grant, ex-Celtic player of course, is the fact that they were so ambitious in their early years. They were so full of belief, and a lot of people think that's arrogance, full of belief in terms of their own ability, Laura, that they both left the club. They both left Fulham. Maurice Yents had to go abroad. He had to leave Fulham, And we know the story about Matt O'Reilly doing the same. They wanted first team football. They wanted the experience at a very young age, which is bold. It's brave to do that. But they've gone and done it, and now they're obviously coming together again, as football often brings players back together, and it's done it with these two guys. And of course, Gents has spoken about the fact that he spoke to O'Reilly, and O'Reilly was going banging on about Celtic, banging the Ange drum. And I think we've got a player in Gents that a few people raised their eyebrows saying he didn't have a great season last year, and that kind of thing. But, again, with the fact that we've brought him in on loan, we've started using the loan deal so much better than we have done before. And you think to yourself, is history repeating itself? Are we getting another player of that calibre that we got last season in Carter Vickers? And if so, then we've won a watch. And I think that it's unfortunate that he might be injured for Sunday, because I was looking forward to seeing him in domestic action. Whether or not he leapfrogged Stephen Welsh, I guess, is another discussion point. Would he have jumped right into that first team? What would that have done to Welsh's confidence after he's basically been called upon since the injury to Starfelt? But I think that it would have been a wee bit unfair, but at the same time, it would have been good to see minutes in Jensen's legs on Sunday.
Yeah, I would have been in full favour of seeing that. The Stephen Welsh is an interesting one, and one I'm sure we'll get into as the season goes on, because I have to say I've always been a big fan of Stephen Welsh, and I'm not really sure he's put a foot wrong for anybody to leapfrog him, but obviously we don't see him every day in training, and what that could possibly be. Brian Murphy says on YouTube we should re-sign Tom Rogic. He still hasn't got a club. I can dream, can't I? I would love to see it personally, and I never thought I'd say that before last season, but I think if you go by what Tommy said when he was leaving last season, I think he's going to be quite settled in Australia at this point. So it's a dream that I don't think is going to come true, unfortunately. Talking about the fact that Jens is injured, Ideguchi's another one who we thought would feature in some form against Aberdeen. It looks as if he's injured as well. There's a little bit of me that's apprehensive about that, because we all know the injury record we had last season, the people we saw pulling up at various points or dropping out through training. Is this just an isolated, unfortunate incident with these two guys, or do you think this is something that's going to be an ongoing concern into this season?
Well, I really hope it's the former, because I think that really affected everything last year. You even go back to the pre-season summer transfer window, Laura, and moves being made based on the injury of Julian. Because if I remember correctly, we expected Julian back in September. So we go out there and we bring in, obviously it worked out brilliantly for us, but we bring in a loan player in Carter Vickers on the last day of the transfer window, simply because it became clear near the end of that transfer window that the recuperation of Julian was slower than we expected, and we know that it didn't quite happen in September and it moved into the latter part of the year. So I think the injuries were massive, particularly in the first part. You look at Giacomakis, the injury problems that he had, which basically made us play an 18-year-old untested B-team player against St Johnstone on Boxing Day after Kyogo pulled up. We only played Kyogo because another player was injured, and we probably shouldn't have played him. And obviously then he had a bit of a long-term, kind of medium-term injury. So yeah, I do hope it's just a couple of niggles. And particularly with Ideguchi, because I feel a bit sorry for him. He's a guy that's been put into the shadows by Maeda and also Hatate, who we've already spoken about. He came in, the three of them came in together. High calibre player, reputation, had been on the books at Leeds United, second crack at British football, and it's not really got started for him. And again, a lot of people have said that he's not really done much. I've liked what I've seen of Ideguchi. I don't think he's a first pick, but he's a player that Ange knows well, and I think he's probably, or he would have been ahead of James Mccarthy in the pecking order had he not been injured. Hopefully he gets fit and quickly, because then it starts to affect the player mentally, doesn't it? The stop-start nature of his Celtic career, and you just want him to get games. You want him to get a run of games, and you want to see what he can do for us.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and I'm going to put you on the spot here because I've got you in my sights on this podcast. So I'm going to ask you the question, because Brian and I were on last Friday, and there were some comments saying we were being a bit harsh on Ideguchi with some of the comments we were making, because as you've said, people have liked what they've seen when he's played. But I guess, and I don't want to put words in Brian's mouth, she's not here to defend himself, but I guess from my point of view, frequent injuries is a feature of being a player. If you can't keep yourself fit, or if your body doesn't allow you to stay fit, that is as much of a feature of your contribution to the team as anything that you do on the park. When do you think comes a point for us where we have to say, he's a bit injury prone, he's not reliable in that sense, and therefore we can't, count on him as a player that we can rely on regardless of how good he is on the pitch? Or am I being too harsh, do you think, there?
Well, I go back to a few conversations I've had with players who played under Alex Ferguson. And I remember Chalky saying that he did not want players in that squad who would be that type of player. You had to be fit. So when players didn't look after themselves, there was a correlation between that and them always being on the treatment table. So when and I'm not saying Ideguchi's one of them, but Alex Ferguson had this rule that if you were injured, then you were not good to him. And I think that Jock Stein was quite ruthless when it came to that as well. If you were injury prone, then he wasn't interested in you. And you would find yourself playing with what they called the stiffs or the reserve team. And then effectively you would be frozen out and moved on. And I'm not saying that's what we should be doing with Ideguchi, but there will come a point, I think, maybe that will be reassessed at the end of this season. Has he adapted to the Scottish game? Has he adapted? And at that point, a decision will be made. But I still think he's in the plans at this stage, and we'll reassess it. Julien would be that player for me. Julien would be that player that I think he's not going to play enough games, he's not going to be fit enough, he's not going to be able to play at the highest tempo. And again, I might be criticised for saying that, because I've seen a few comments coming in saying, no, Julien's part of the plans. I'm not convinced he is. I think that Julien is holding up a transfer. That's what I would say. He's holding up moves. I think Hatate is holding up moves at Celtic. And that could be frustrating, I guess, for a manager as well. I'm pretty sure that given a chance, he'll offload Mikey Johnson, Julien and Hatate and bring in maybe 2 players at that stage. So maybe not, I'm not going to say you're being harsh, but I think that my view on that is far more towards the Julien type of player. And the fact that, you know what, he's never got started since he came back from injury, time to go. And maybe a question mark over James McCarthy, even though he's fit.
Yeah, Carlene says Ideguchi got hacked down against Alloa, can't stop that. So he's maybe more along the lines of your line of thinking, that kind of thing, of Ideguchi's maybe not the injury-prone player that we might be talking about there, but he is has been unfortunate with some of the things that have happened. I do agree that I think Mikey Johnson and certainly Chris Julian, since that big knee injury, are more the type of player that you maybe can't rely on just because their bodies aren't, maybe built for the type of game that we're trying to play. I wasn't planning on talking about this, but I think now that you brought it up, the Julian situation is an interesting one, because if we take him and Hatate into account, and obviously money's a big factor in this as well, but is there any other reason for you that you think they would be potentially holding up a move other than they just don't feel it's right for them at the time? Because, if I was Christopher Julian, for example, I would jump at the chance of a move to a club like Schalke. They're pretty big team playing one of the top five leagues in Europe. Any chance he would have to go there and get a career back on track that has been, put off course through no fault of his own, really. I think that would be a great opportunity. And I have to say, I didn't hear anything to say that it was necessarily the club's decision, but I was very shocked when it fell through because I thought it was a great opportunity for him. Absolutely.
And I think, again, it's been raised that I'm obsessed with his Instagram post. I'm not obsessed with it. I think it's relevant. It's relevant in that the player probably believed that the deal was on. The deal was going to go through. And maybe at that point he's checked out. Can he check back in? Well, of course he can. But we don't know for sure what actually happened, why that broke down. The club are never going to come out and say he's failed a medical, because then it's going to be a struggle to get him another club. Then, obviously, if you're doing a loan deal with the permanent option at the end of it, you're talking at the loan stage about what your wages are going to be in year 2 when you become a permanent player. That has been suggested as being the issue, and it's broken down. We're talking about 2 players that cost us 12 million quid. They would have come in, Laura, on big wages, both of them. And it's about, and again, Jetty's a strange one because he's hardly an old player. Julien's getting to that late 20s, moving into his 30s. Jetty's nowhere near that. And he'll be looking at his next move very carefully because he's had 2 flops in a row. Big money move from Basel to West Ham didn't work out. Big money move from West Ham to Celtic didn't work out. This is a guy who's an international footballer who scored a lot of goals in his native country. And the next move he makes is going to be crucial to him getting his career back on track. So I just think there's a wee bit of that as well. Both players, I'm pretty sure, because of the cost of their wages, it will be a loan with an option to buy at the end of it. How much are the players doing to hold that up? It's difficult to say. I hope that's not the case because, for the benefit of their careers, Laura, they need to move on, both of them.
Yeah, I think one thing's for certain, it's not going to benefit them or the club for them to sit on the bench, or even worse, not on the bench in Glasgow when they could be getting football elsewhere. But if Ange's suggestions are anything to go by this week, certainly Hatate looks like there will be a move in the offing for him of some description before the transfer window closes. And we all know it, Ange doesn't say anything by accident, so it'll be interesting to see if and when that happens. Moving ahead to obviously this weekend, we've got Aberdeen in the opener of the league season. Strangely enough, and I'm going to bring up this comment from Magnet67, ridiculous kick-off time, once again TV telling us what to do and we should just accept it, despite the pits and sky throaters, we should stand firm and say no. I don't know that I agree with all of that sentiment, but what I will say is I do agree that I think it's a bit of a strange kick-off time for the champions to be kicking off at 4:30 on a Sunday in the opening weekend of the season. I mean, I'm saying this, not even, it could be Rangers, it could be Livingston, it could be Hamilton, it could be whoever wins the league. I'm picking names out of a hat there, but, were you shocked when the league listing came out and we saw that fixture just before we even go on to talk about the match? I can't believe we're going to have played nearly a full round of games before we even see the champions play their first match of the season.
I'm never shocked about anything in Scottish football, Laura, because what we've got, right, is we're in a very small country with 2 massive, huge brands and 2 massive clubs, right? And when you're looking at other countries with 2 huge clubs, they're massive countries. We're not. So we've actually got a product that doesn't match the support that Scottish football has, and also these 2 huge brands that Scottish football has. And I don't think we've ever managed it properly. The authorities have never ever managed it properly. The SFA and the league, they've never ever managed what we've got at our disposal. But what we show time and time again as a football nation is we constantly prove that we do have a very good product. And I just need to go back to the comments made in relation to the Scottish invasion of Italian football that's ongoing at the moment. And there was a good interview just a few weeks back whereby one of the Italian scouts was going on about how criminally underrated Scottish football is. It is criminally underrated and it's criminally undersold. It's like we just take whatever scraps are thrown at us when you look at sponsorship deals, broadcasting deals. And by the way, there are numerous clubs out there who do themselves no favours whatsoever.
Do you know a nation that I think is certainly comparable to us in terms of footballing level, who really are riding the crest of a wave right now, is Portuguese football. They are making a lot of big sales of players to big clubs. We've seen Diaz go to Liverpool, and I know that was from Porto, but there's a lot of scouts looking in that market for players because they're seeing it as a market where there's a good quality of player that they can buy for a cheaper price, and I don't see why we don't fit that mould personally.
Well, I think that the talent is there. This is the big thing about Scottish football. The amount of, let's go beyond even first team players, the amount of youth players leaving our game before they kick a ball for a Scottish football team shows you that the talent's there. Then just look at some of the outgoings of the Premiership clubs this season, and you've got players leaving Hibs, Rangers and Aberdeen, and you're looking at these players and thinking, well, big money or young Scottish talent who are going for decent cash. So the talent is in Scottish football, no doubt about it. The clubs, as I say, are partly to blame because they continually shoot themselves in the foot. I mean, you just got to look at the pricing of the food and drink at Celtic Park for the friendly games, right? And it was all over Twitter. So when you've got that captive audience, don't abuse it. That's the first thing. Don't abuse the fan who's already spent big money to get to the stadium and get inside the stadium. But then also, you've got clubs who, they're in that view of, and I know JP had an online discussion with Alan Burrows and Motherwell about this, clubs who don't maximise their income. You know, when it's obvious that you've got these two massive brands in Scottish football where wherever they play there's a huge crowd, maximise it, and a lot of clubs can't do that either. And then you've got the ineptitude of those governing the game in Scotland. So nothing surprises me. It shouldn't be that the champions are unfurling the flag after all the other fixtures have been played on the Saturday. That's just ridiculous. But they'll bend over and they'll take the poor broadcasting deal and the poor sponsorship deal, Laura, and they'll do as they're told. And I just think it's, it's one of these things that as fans, what actually can you do? Because, there's fans forums where you can let your feelings known to your own club. But we've gone through a process in the last few years, the last decade or so, where it's proven that the governance of our game is not fit for purpose.
Yeah, I think that's something that most people would agree with. And I don't know. I think the pageantry and the spectacle that is the unfurling of the league flag, regardless of who it's for, is a great way to kick off a season, at least for the fans of that club. And the fact that we're not going to be able to do that or experience that, it's just a great shame. And that's not even taking into account the Aberdeen fans who are having to travel down for a 4:30 kick-off on a Sunday, potentially having to get back up to work, make a 3 or 4 hour drive up the road, on a Sunday night. But
and then all the Irish fans coming over. There's no thought process. The huge amount of people that come over from Ireland to watch the game, and they're an afterthought, Laura. They're an absolute afterthought, and they should be at the forefront of the planning of an event like this. But again, it's one of the things. Do I see it changing? Well, in my time supporting Scottish football and Celtic since 1987, it's got worse. The governance of our game's got worse, and I don't see it improving anytime soon. Whenever there's a strong figure, I just don't see them ever given the correct title in Scottish football. Whenever there is a strong figure in Scottish football, they never get the role that they deserve, I don't think.
Yeah, I think it's unfair on a lot of levels, and hopefully it's something they can look at for the future. But as you say, I'm not holding out too much hope for it. Let's look ahead to the game in question. Regardless of the time it's being played, we are playing Aberdeen, who had a less than great game last season. I was at the Aberdeen game and interviewed Stephen Glass just prior to his departure from the club last year. And they did struggle an awful lot, regardless of having what people saw as great signings, one of them being our former captain Scott Brown last season. It's not going to be the easiest opener that we've ever had, I would say, but we do always fare well against Aberdeen at Celtic Park as well, which is a great thing to see, regardless of their own size and history. How do you see this going tomorrow generally for us, or Sunday, I should say?
Well, I think, like you say, we've got a really good record against Aberdeen, particularly at Celtic Park, but I think Aberdeen are going to be a different beast this season. Although they have lost a couple of their star players. And one of those I am delighted to see away, because he always scored against us, and that was your man Ferguson. And he was one of these players that's away to Italy. So he's gone, and Calvin Ramsey's away. I like to look at him as well at Liverpool. They've spent a bit of cash, have Aberdeen. They have spent a bit of cash, and they've brought in quite a few players as well. It's yet to be seen if they make the impact that I'm sure the Aberdeen fans will be hoping for, but they can't be much worse than they were last season. Take away the games against Rangers, and Aberdeen were really poor last season. I think the appointment of Glass was a disaster. I rate Jimmy Goodwin really highly as a manager. I think his progress has been tremendous. It's a kind of trajectory that I thought would have happened with Jack Ross when he's gone from Alloa to St Mirren. And I think the move after that for Jack Ross was an Aberdeen stroke Hibs style move, but he went away down to Sunderland, and it might have came a wee bit too early for him. But I think Goodwin's a very good gaffer. He obviously has a Celtic state of mind as well. But we'll be too strong, Laura. I do think we'll be too strong for them. And But as I say, I think they'll give a very good account of themselves, Aberdeen.
Yeah, if anybody wants to see just how much Jim Goodwin can get under your skin, you just need to watch one of the most viewed videos on this channel when they beat us at Celtic Park, and I went on one of my infamous post-match rants that Jim, our very own Jim, warns me of. But yeah, he's got an upward trajectory. Aberdeen is a fitting club for him as a manager, and it's a exciting game, I think, for us as Celtic supporters to have Aberdeen coming to Celtic Park. But like you say, I've been at a game at Celtic Park where we beat them 9-0 and, you know, blew them away. That was a number of years ago now, but it's just going to be interesting to see, like say, what kind of Don's team comes out this season, because, you know, last season especially, beyond the games against Celtic and Rangers, like you said, they were very, very poor, and it wasn't any surprise to me that Stephen Glass was let go, even though he himself came in with such a pedigree and such excitement from fans of Aberdeen, not just because he was a former player, but because of his potential as a manager. Looking ahead, before we look at doing our lineups for tomorrow, I'm just looking at the fixtures for the rest of the seasons, or not the rest of the season, but the rest of the month of August anyway. So we start with Celtic against Aberdeen on Sunday the 31st of July, followed by an away trip to Ross County, an away trip to Kilmarnock, home to Hearts, away to Dundee United. Then we've got the League Cup second round away to Ross County before the match against Rangers at Celtic Park on the 3rd of September. I have to say, looking at that, if you ignore the fact that obviously Kilmarnock are newly promoted, usually Rugby Park is a reasonably difficult place for us to go. We're going to Tannadice, Ross County never make it easy. I mean, on the one hand, you could say that's a tough opening, but on the other hand, I think if you get through with as near to 100% points wise there, you've taken care of a lot of business in that first month, haven't you?
You definitely have, and particularly when I was looking at all the teams this week, and I'm looking at the likes of Hibs, and I'm on the fence with Hibs. I don't know how their season's going to go. Aberdeen, like I was saying before, I think that they're going to be top six, top six, maybe even top four. But the one team that you mentioned from that run of fixtures that I think is a potential, and it might be obvious, and I think it's Ross County. Now, Malcolm Mackay, I'm not a massive fan of Malcolm Mackay, but when you look at the job that he's done at Ross County, I think he's done a phenomenal job, Laura. And again, some of our famous moments last season were against Ross County, of course. The one I'm thinking about is Tony Ralston with that header. Someone posted it this morning, and I never ever tire of watching that. What was it, 97th minute? 98th minute? Something like that. 100th?
The only other goal I think is up there with that from last season was Leo Abada's winner against Dundee United. That was another cracker. Yeah,
I know.
Good memories. But yeah.
Just that moment. But again, you've just got to look at the fact they've lost their star man. So a lot of these players have lost big players, but they've brought in 10 players at last count. So Malcolm Mackay, when you look at the players he brought in, he's obviously got a very good contact book, Laura. I mean, I'm taking it for granted that Mackay has final say in recruitment up there. I mean, maybe there's a system whereby there's a different process of decision making, but it does look as though Mackay has spread the net pretty wide. He's brought in 10 players. I think they're a bit of an unknown quantity at this stage. That's going to be a very, very difficult game up there, and it'll give us an idea as to how the cup game's going to go as well.
Yeah, another unknown quantity obviously is Dundee United, no longer with manager Tam Courts, who's headed, unusually enough, over to Hungary. We'll need to get Kevin to keep tabs on him for us.
I know, and he will, because obviously we've got our man with his ear on the ground. I always thought it was... Listen, Tam Court's done a great job in that, but it was pretty funny because his dad, his own man, had a butcher shop in Cowdenbeath. And when I used to work in Cowdenbeath, some of the boys used to go up there and get stuff out the butchers. And then when Thomas Courts gets his job at Dundee United, I'm just thinking, Tam Courts the butcher. Anyway, he's done very, very well. And then Jack Ross, of course, back in the game.
Yeah.
A manager who, I've got to say, I don't want him as a manager of Celtic. I'll put that out there straight away, because Kevin Graham used to put that out all the time. However, I think that the biggest mistake Hibs made was getting rid of Jack Ross, and I think he'll do really well.
I was going to say the same thing. I thought he was very, very harshly treated, and I even thought actually his replacement, Sean Maloney, was very harshly treated by Hibs. I don't think either of them did a particularly bad job. I don't know what Hibs are expecting from their team or from their club, because I think both Jack Ross and Sean Maloney, sort of took them as far as either of them could take them, and I'm not sure what they're expecting from managers if those two haven't performed adequately.
I was speaking to a Hibby today. He came in to the studio and he was talking about the fact that there's a frustration that the players switch it off and switch it on depending on whether or not they're, the manager's suited to them in their mind. So you've got a group of players there who, when you look at the finish, it was the highest finish that a Hibs team had, finishing third in about 18 years since Tony Mowbray was in charge with that great group of players under
and
Jack
the Scottish
Ross.
Cup final as well. Yeah.
Scottish Cup final. They're in a semi-final when they're getting a League Cup final rather. By the time Jack Ross gets his jotters, but again, the Sean Maloney thing, it's player power. I don't know where that leaves Sean Maloney. I don't know if he's a good coach. That's left to be seen. But I don't know where it leaves him in his career. But it just seems to me that you've got a group of players there, and I don't think that you can switch it on and off because momentum is massive in football. Mm-hmm. And the pre-season might give you like a reset. But the gaffers came in. I thought, looking on paper, that he's brought in some decent players, even though one of them was an accident. They've brought in some good players at Hibs. But it's not in the pre-season games and the League Cup games. It's not really got going for them. But yeah, Jack Ross for me. There was also, let's not forget Leanne Dempster leaving Hibs. I think that was huge. That was massive. And you just got
especially
to look
when you see the work she's putting in at Queen's Park as well.
100%. I think that is a tale that it'd be interesting to see how they do. I know we're digressing a wee bit, but Leanne Dempster's departure has been massive for Hibs as well as Jack Ross's. Yeah,
no, absolutely. It's interesting and something that we can maybe chat about in more depth as the season goes on, because Scottish football, to me, as we've touched on, is a very saleable market, and there's plenty of interesting stories and things that we could talk about going forward, which I hope we do. But let's get back to Celtic for the last 10 minutes of the show before everybody starts putting in the chat, this is a Celtic show, talk about Celtic. We will do. Let's go down the rabbit hole of predicted 11s. Now, beyond the fact that Ange is a reasonably unpredictable character, let's start at the back. Who's between the sticks for you, considering Joe Hart was such a major factor last season in our success? He shored things up where they could not be shored up so often previously. But our second choice keeper, who's come in from Dundee United, is a strong contender as well. Do you see any change between the sticks, or will Joe Hart keep a hold of that number 1 jersey for now?
I think Hart is definitely the number 1. Siegrist has had a couple of no bad appearances pre-season.
Do you know why I never said his name? Because I kept thinking Sieb Dijkstra, but that's my age showing.
Oh, Sieb Dijkstra with that moustache.
Anyway, sorry.
Brilliant. And the chant, he was a bit of a legend. Joe Hart, for me, I think needed the signing of a Siegrist. I almost said Sieb, of a Siegrist, just like Taylor needed the signing of a Bernabe. And I think that what we're going to see there is two players who know that there can be no wiggle room there in terms of their performances. Taylor finished the season, I know I'm jumping a wee bit, but Taylor finished the season off really, really well and definitely has the number 3 shorts. Joe Hart's, for me, number 1 every single day of the week. Until such times as, he goes through a dip in form or injury. But also I think that Ange is looking at that and thinking, well, there might be occasions where Joe needs a wee rest. So you give him that rest, and you've got Siegrist. I wasn't confident with other goalies we had last season, but I'm confident with Siegrist coming in.
Yeah, I would think he's about as strong a second choice keeper as any team in the league would have, because I really thought he was quite outstanding in some performances for Dundee United, especially against us. It wouldn't surprise me if that's how he caught Ange's eye, because I'm pretty sure Ange hadn't arrived from Japan saying I want that goalkeeper from Dundee United, but who knows, I may be wrong. But I have to agree with your first choices. I think Joe Hart will stick between the sticks, and I think Taylor will be at left back until such times as he does something to lose that jersey, because I think he has earned it. Before we look at the other choices, what about system going forward? Like, I think, for all intents and purposes, as much as we talk about the inverted fullbacks and the dynamic way in which the formation changes when we're in possession, it is essentially a 4-3-3 that we've been playing most of the last season. Do you see us sticking with that shape, or is there going to be any change to that, do you think?
I think he will stick to that, and you know, from reading between the lines, because everything Ange says you pour over it, don't you? You watch every press conference, you read every interview, and I don't think he's going to change that at all, even in the European games. And by the way, there is such a thing as this cavalier approach being a traditional Celtic kind of approach. You go back to the great sides of the 60s and 70s and the way that they played their game, with one exception being the away game against Dukla Prague, where we defended just to get through the tie in 1967. But I think that we've seen how it doesn't work under Brendan Rodgers. And I think that's maybe at the forefront of a lot of our minds, Laura. We get a wee bit worried if you come up against the big guns and you try and go toe-to-toe and play this brand of football, there is this possibility that they'll just pick away at you. And the worst thing sometimes you can do is go ahead against them because they'll score 5 or 7 goals against you. But it's going to be an interesting development. But I said during the week as well, and I know, again, I'm digressing a wee bit, but I'm going to go into the European side of things. I used the 2 games against Leverkusen last season, and I use the 2 of them as a gauge because I think that in the first game, now correct me if I'm wrong, you covered the game, didn't you? Tony and I were at it, and you covered it. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, I think so, yeah.
And I remember coming away from that being hugely disappointed with our performance, and then watching back the post-match where you guys were quite positive. So I'm thinking, so you kind of check yourself before you get back on the bulletin. You watch the game in the morning, and then you've got a different perspective on it. But you know, looking back on that, I think they picked up naiveties in our team, albeit some of the goals were individual errors, and the penalty kick for me was very, very soft. It was harsh against Carter Vickers. Couldn't get out the road of that. And the 4-0 scoreline at home, you're looking at that thinking that's a pasting at home. But when you compare the second game away from home and the way that listen, we were 8 minutes away from winning that game. We were up with 8 minutes to go. And if you get the 2 points, I know it's all fantasy here, but if you get those 2 points, you qualify for the next stage.
Yeah.
And obviously there was frailties at the back and we lost the game 3-2 in the end. But if you compare the 2 games, I think what it proves is that Ange didn't play in European football before, but he learns very quickly. And I think those 2 games show that. The game at home, the game away, and there's only 2 months between the games, and how quickly Ange Postecoglou learned his lesson. And I think we're going to see elements of that in the Champions League. I think mistakes will be made, and it's maybe next season before we see the advantage of how Ange looks at that data, looks at the style, looks at the approach, and then changes it. But it might be next season before we see the benefit of the way that he approaches his game and how quickly he learns his lesson.
Yeah. It's the story of being a Celtic supporter in Europe, unfortunately, for as long as I can remember, that, if it hadn't been for this mistake or that mistake, we would have got further. But it's hopefully something we can rid ourselves of and going into this season, or at least, as you say, into maybe next season. But I'm sure Ange's mouth will be watering at the prospect of going up against some of the coaches of the standard that he's going to be up against in the Champions League. And I think that's the next big thing we're all looking forward to, is the draw for the group stages, which can't be too far away now.
August can't come quickly enough.
No, exactly. Going back to Sunday and to Aberdeen, we've talked about goalkeeper and left back. The back line's going to be an interesting one, especially at centre back. We've obviously got Starfelt, who's not featured too much in the pre-season. We've got new permanent signing Cameron Carter-Vickers, Stephen Welsh, who we talked a little bit about beforehand. Who do you see being your pairing for Sunday more specifically, but also going forward into the season? Is it going to be Carter-Vickers and Starfelt? Is Jens going to make an appearance when he comes back from injury? Where do you see it going?
Well, I think that, like yourself, Stephen Welsh has done really, really well. I mean, you look at his introduction to the Celtic side, basket case of a season, right? And I always go back to that picture of him devastated when he's thrown in the 2-0 game at Celtic Park against Rangers. Devastated, sitting there. And Olivier and Cham's kind of looking over as if, what you worried about, mate, kind of thing. And I think it was the hardest introduction ever for a young player that season. And I thought he equipped himself very, very well. And then you've got last season where the chances were few and far between because you had this brilliant partnership developing between Starfelt and Carter-Vickers, which I think, I'm in no doubt, is still the 2 first picks at centre-half when fit. But what Welsh has got is he's got the confidence in knowing that Ange wants him because he's knocked back 2 deals, Udinese and Toulouse. And it's quite clear that he's his second choice, because when there's an injury to Carl Starfelt, he doesn't go to Chris Jullien and put him straight in. Stephen Welsh has been that kind of first choice in the absence of Starfelt. Yeah. So I think that Welsh needs to look at this scenario similarly to where Tony Ralston was this time last season and think, right, all the circumstances has allowed me to get some game time. Let's prove myself here. Now, when Starfelt comes back in, I'm pretty sure he's going to be the first choice, but does he get thrown back in, or does Welsh still have a few games? It all depends on his performances, doesn't it? And then you add the extra element of Jens, who I think we would have seen a performance from, maybe half an hour from, on Sunday if he was fit. And that just shows the depth that we're starting to build. Jullien, again, some people might think I'm harsh. I just don't think he's at the races. I really don't.
Yeah, it tells you everything I think about Jullien's chances that I forgot to even mention him in breaking down who we had as a choice, which tells you probably where he is in a lot of Celtic supporters' minds, but we'll see what happens. I personally think Carter Vickers is there no matter what, as long as he stays fit. Starfelt, I still think there's a possibility of an upgrade from him, and I would like to see if Jens is that upgrade, but until then, I think Starfelt remains first choice at the centre-back position with Carter Vickers. Right back, we still have Juranovic at this point. There has been talk of him obviously moving on, but I would say personally he's my first choice with Anthony Ralston as a more than decent backup going into the season. What's your thoughts on that? Do you agree with that summation?
I do, and I'm going to dig my heels in here and say Champions League music equals no sales, and hopefully Juranovic will be a Celtic player this season. Now, I feel a bit sorry for Ralston at this stage because I think he's been far superior to Juranovic in the pre-season. Mm-hmm. Now, you go back to the first comment you pulled up, pre-season means nothing. If Juranovic gets picked ahead of Ralston, he might be thinking the same because his performances have been brilliant. Goal-saving challenges and all that kind of stuff, what you tend to expect from Tony Ralston now. But if you're looking at the strongest 11 and what I expect Ange also to, taking that into account, what he's going to select, I think Juranovic starts. But very much like Turnbull and Abada, who won't start for me, you've got no doubts about these guys. I mean, these are strong replacements if the likes of Juranovic is out, hopefully just temporarily because I don't want him to move permanently. But yeah, JJ at right back, Taylor at left back, Carter Vickers and Welsh in the middle. That's my defence for Sunday.
Yeah, I'm in total agreement with that, and it's going to be interesting to see if Ange follows our lead and names that, because we all know he's watching this show to make his decisions, or I would like to think so anyway. Something that makes me doubt that, but we'll see. Moving on into the midfield, Liam Downey brings up an interesting point here on YouTube. Ange has been dabbling with a double pivot in midfield. Now, most of what we've seen last season was a holding midfielder of some description, whether it was McGregor, whether it was Beaton, whether it was somebody else, and then the two attacking midfielders, which was most often O'Reilly and Rogic, or O'Reilly and Hatate, O'Reilly and McGregor, some mix of those players and that number of players. We do have other options there now. Turnbull's obviously back to full fitness. We've brought in Aaron Moy, Ideguchi, excluding this recent injury, should hopefully be more of an option for us going forward. Do you see us dabbling in that double pivot that the commenter was talking about, or do you see us sticking with the previous shape, and who do you see taking up those spaces for you?
I do think we'll revert back to the tried and tested and what we know can work. Also, I'm of the view, Laura, that when it comes to a defensive midfielder, how often do you need that in Scottish football, particularly at home? At home. And when you've got a player like McGregor, who I wouldn't describe as being a defensive midfielder, although I know he can play that role, he has got enough attributes to be playing the old school number 8 while still playing that anchor when required. It's a wee bit like, I am old school in my kind of views on how a midfield shapes, and you've got a 6, an 8 and a 10, whereby 8 is your old school Paul McStay player who kind of links back to front. Your number 6 is generally the more defensive player, and your number 10 is that flair player who kind of links middle to front. And I think that what we've got there is 3 players who who are definitely starters, and 2 of them I wouldn't say are defensive midfielders in Hatate and McGregor. But like we said at the beginning of the show, they are more than capable of doing that job. And then when you can, and they're first picks for me, Hatate and McGregor, with O'Reilly as your number 10. Turnbull has been brilliant so far in pre-season, so it's going to, again, seem a wee bit harsh on Turnbull, as it will for Ralston, not to start. But in terms of the strongest 11, I don't think he's quite there yet. If he turns in that kind of performance in competitive games, then he's going to end up being in the starting 11. But that, for me, is the strongest part of our team at the moment, and it's been strengthened by Aaron Moy. There was a wee bit of, not even controversy, but a bit of criticism of that signing, I think, afterwards. Not particularly on Axum. I can't remember anybody saying it was a bad signing on Axum. And it's yet to be seen. But I just think, again, low risk. He's got all the attributes defensively. He's got the attributes attacking offensively as well. Bit of criticism after his debut. Cut the guy a bit slack. Let him get into the groove of it. And I think he'll be a very, very good squad player. But he is behind those 3 that I've mentioned. And he's also behind David Turnbull when it comes to selection.
Yeah, so the Aaron Moy thing is an interesting one, because I think Brian and I talked about it last week, and I think the only way in which we thought it was maybe not a great signing was that we had always thought that the intention behind every signing was to sign better players than you already had. I don't know that Moy fits that description, but I think he certainly bridges a gap in terms of quality between what some of the choices are. So between, say, a Hatate and a McCarthy, if you want to compare those 2 players, he definitely bridges that gap in terms of quality, and I think he can certainly be a useful option for us, because, as everybody knows, using an entire squad full of players is important. But I have to say I'm mostly in agreement with you for the midfield. McGregor and O'Reilly are no-brainers for me. Based on current form, I would say Hatate would take the other position for me. I'm a big fan of David Turnbull, as everybody knows. What I would hope to see from him this season that would potentially make him more competitive with Hatate for that shirt is, I would just like to see him speed up his game a little bit more to match the other players in the squad. I think before his injury last season, he was guilty a little bit of slowing the play down compared to other players, but it certainly didn't show in the selection sense, because Ange selected him every game he had him available pretty much. So, maybe he likes a bit of that element in the midfield as well, but I certainly would like to see him up his tempo if he's going to fit into this squad this season. And maybe he's had a chance to do that working with the manager for a bit longer, but I think going right now, I would have to agree with your first choices of O'Reilly, McGregor and Hatate. Do you think that's fair on Turnbull, or do you think he can just offer a bit something different if he keeps his game the way it is?
Well, the unfortunate thing with Turnbull is it was just timing. It was bad, very bad timing for him to drop out the squad with injury when he did last year, because he's gone into that season as a Young Player of the Year. He was kind of like the breakthrough star of Neil Lennon's final season in charge. And he was basically picked every time he was fit under Ange Postecoglou. But then, whilst he's injured, we bring in some very, very good options, 2 of whom hit the ground running. And it just so happens that both of them are midfield players. So now Turnbull's in a position where he is, I think, has shown in pre-season what he can do, but he needs to do it in the competitive games. I don't want a player like Turnbull to get frustrated. He's at an age, Laura, where he needs to play games. But, I mean, it's healthy in one respect in that we've got a really strong squad and we've got strong backups. But you don't want a player like him to get frustrated, because he's obviously got aspirations to play for Scotland, which means you've got to be getting games. If he's not getting games, he might, looking ahead to the end of this year, he might start getting frustrated. You don't want that. You want to try and keep a happy camp all the time. And with that in mind, Hatate played a lot of games last year. Sometimes you were thinking, this boy's crying out for a rest, and then the starting 11 would come up again and he was picked again. So it gives us that option to mix it up a little bit as well. And again, I'm expecting huge things from O'Reilly this season. I think that he is going to be key to our success. And again, I just think every challenge that he's had, he's rose to it. And now he's going to have that challenge of Champions League football. And I'm looking forward to seeing players like him and Hatate and Carter Vickers and how they're going to rise to that occasion as well. Going back to that point about Moy that you made, I guess that my question would be where, if Moy comes in and starts performing the way we know he can, he's maybe been a couple of years out, and I don't mean out the game, but out the public eye of playing high-level Premiership football, right? If he starts playing at some kind of level that we know he can, where does it leave McCarthy?
Yeah. I listen, my thoughts on James McCarthy have been well aired on this podcast. I thought it was a mistake to sign him when we did. It was even more of a mistake to give him a 4-year contract. And I think the signings that have been made only prove that even more so to be the case, because it screamed of, especially when he was talking in the initial press conference about that the move had been on the cards for a number of years and now the time felt right. That just felt to me like a slap in the face to the new manager, like a slap in the face to a lot of the people who have come into the club since. And I'm not blaming James McCarthy specifically for that, but I think it says an awful lot about the circumstances in which his move came about. And if we've learned anything about Ange over the last season, it's that he's not going to be told to play a player. And so unfortunately what we have is a situation where you've got James McCarthy earning what I imagine is a very nice pay packet for doing not very much. And I don't think that's his fault. I don't think that's the manager's fault. I just think the circumstances of the signing were poor on most levels.
You know, I think you look at the early signings, right? And some of it, I reckon, will be legacy targets, deals that may have started prior to Ange coming in. It's a bit unfair on the player, certainly unfair on the manager. But you compare that to the kind of later signings and you think, well, there has been a change. I mean, Zazie Irigidi was never a player that Ange signed. Never a player Ange signed, right? Because we know that deal and the deal for Liam Shaw were already in the mix. Was the McCarthy deal already in? So it's a difficult situation for the player to be in if he comes to a club and then very quickly realises, right, it wasn't the gaffer that purchased me, it was somebody else. You remember Paddy McCourt talking about that. He turns up at training, Gordon Strachan didn't really know who he was. And, you know, that can't be very comfortable for the player. And then the manager's got a guy that he's then got to make a decision on, but he's already there. You know, most managers get a chance to make that decision on bringing the player in, but he's already there. And it didn't get going for James McCarthy, and I'm not 100% confident that it will this season either. The fact that we're still looking for other midfielders, there's a couple of names in the press over the last couple of days that have been linked to Celtic. So you think to yourself, where does it leave the likes of James McCarthy? And again, on that contract, that bumper contract that he's got, it might be a loan deal to get him games.
Yeah. Michael McDonald says, you're guessing. We are guessing. That's all we can do because we don't have an inside line at the club who can tell us. And even if we did, I don't think they would. But you've got to go on timelines. You've got to go on what you know about the way the football world works. And that's my opinion based on how I know these things work. But, you know, if anybody wants to come out from Celtic and tell me I'm incorrect in that assertion, they'd be more than welcome to. We'll wait and see if that happens. We're running a bit over time, but we've still got to cover the forward line, so we'll do that quickly before we head off, Paul John. As everybody knows, we could sit and talk Celtic for hours and frequently do, which is what we're doing right now. Forward line options are there. Giakoumakis, Furuhashi hopefully back to full fitness, Leo Labada, James Forrest, Jota now permanently signed. Who's your front three?
And again, this is based on what happened last season, how their season finished, but also the performances in pre-season, because you could not possibly leave Maeda out of the team based on the performances in the pre-season. So he starts for me on the right, Jota's on the left, Kyogo's through the middle. Is that the strongest three? Well, based on current form, I think it is. As we go through the season, you will see that interchanging. You'll see games by Abada, you'll see James Forrest getting games. Not sure Mikey Johnston will get many games. And you'll get Giakoumakis coming in and perhaps even a third striker. But at this moment in time, I think you start with Maeda, Kyogo and Jota.
That's an interesting one for me because I would say on form again, I think I probably agree with your choices. But if you ask me my ideal one, form sheet out the window, I really like the look last season when they were flying of Jota on the left, Kyogo through the middle and Abada on the right. I thought they produced an awful lot of really good performances. I think it says a lot that neither of us are really considering James Forrest in the picture, because I think it's clear from last season that his only opportunity now is probably as a filler for any of those front three positions now. It might be because of injuries that he's had, or certainly just his age for a player who's relied on pace so much in the past. But it'll be interesting to see how he features this season. But you can't take the shirt away from Maeda, from Jota, or from Kyogo, I don't think, going into this first game. But to have those options on the bench as well is fantastic.
It is, and I think they'll interchange. You've seen a wee bit of that in the pre-season. Jota and Maeda will interchange and switch. But yeah, you're talking about guys like Forrest, Abada, Turnbull, Ralston. That's a strong bench, and that's important as well, particularly when we get into the European games. When you look at some of the early benches last season, it was so weak, and we were crying out for changes because we weren't happy sometimes with the performances. But you look on the bench, there was no options, particularly offensively, and I just think that there's far more options now for Ange. I don't know if you want a prediction for the score on Sunday, Laura.
Go for it.
3-0 Celtic.
I am going to, just so as I'm not agreeing with you on every portion, I'm going to say 4-0 Celtic. I could see Kyogo getting a wee brace in there, which I would quite like to see. Let's
revisit this next week and see if we are just guessing, or if we've got any kind of idea of what's going on.
Listen, I wouldn't like to go back through the history of my predictions and suggest that I'm any kind of mistake made when it comes to these things, but I hope I've got something right over the season anyway. But we shall see. The big day is upon us. Finally, we'll be getting back into the thing that matters, the football, and we will be here for all of it to see each and every one of you in the comments. Join us for the match coverage as always on Axom. Subscribe if you haven't done, and you'll get notifications when we go live on Sunday for that. Paul, John, it's been a pleasure this Friday to be joined by you. Hopefully it happens again soon. Thanks to everybody in the comments for watching, and we will see you again this weekend.